The night was quiet, with only a few cars moving along the empty streets. The city lights cast long shadows on the pavement, and the occasional street lamp flickered, adding a sense of unease. A man was driving home after a long day at work. He had been handling a tough case and was looking forward to relaxing once he reached home. The hum of the engine and the soft music playing from the radio were the only sounds accompanying him. He felt calm, unaware of the sudden turn his evening was about to take. As he approached a less busy intersection, flashing lights appeared in his rearview mirror. He knew immediately that a police officer was signaling him to pull over. He slowed down and guided his car to the side of the road, keeping his hands visible on the steering wheel. He stayed calm, as he always did in situations like this, understanding that remaining collected was the best way to handle unexpected stops. The officer approached the car quickly, his footsteps loud against the pavement. His face was stern, his eyes scanning the man with suspicion. The man rolled down his window and greeted him politely. "Good evening, officer. Is there a problem?" The officer's tone was cold and direct. "Do you know why I stopped you?" he asked. There was no warmth in his voice, only an underlying hostility. The man shook his head, maintaining a calm demeanor. "No, officer. I'm not sure why." "Can you tell me?" The officer sighed, leaning slightly closer to the car. "You were speeding back there. Step out of the vehicle, please." The man complied, stepping out slowly, his hands still visible, making no sudden movements. He could feel the tension in the air, the way the officer's eyes scrutinized every detail of his appearance, every movement he made. There was an unease that went beyond the routine traffic stop. The officer circled the car, his steps deliberate. He peered inside, checking the man's vehicle thoroughly. "License and registration," he demanded, his voice sharp. The man handed over his documents calmly, his eyes meeting the officer's. There was no fear, only a quiet confidence that came from knowing he was always careful and law-abiding. Yet he noticed the way the officer lingered, the way his gaze seemed to weigh judgment on him rather than assessing the situation fairly. The officer flipped through the documents quickly, muttering under his breath. "You don't live around here, do you?" he asked, suspicion heavy in his tone. The man replied politely, "No, officer. I work across town. I'm heading home now." He could feel the tension in the officer's posture, the way he shifted uneasily, as if the man's words didn't match what he expected. There was an assumption in the air, a silent judgment that made the atmosphere heavier. The officer stepped closer, leaning slightly toward the man. "Mind if I search your vehicle?" he asked, though his tone made it clear he expected a yes. The man remained calm, shaking his head politely. "I'm afraid I can't consent to that without cause, officer. I'm not aware of any reason for a search." The officer's eyes narrowed, his patience thinning. He seemed frustrated that the man did not immediately comply, that he did not react with fear or submission. Around them, the street remained quiet. A few people walking their dogs glanced over curiously but kept their distance. The man could feel the eyes of strangers on him, yet he did not let it affect his composure. He understood that staying calm was not just about protecting himself, but also about de-escalating the situation, preventing it from turning violent. The officer's tone grew harsher. "I don't like your attitude. You think you're above the law?" he demanded. The man replied evenly, "I respect the law, officer. I'm only asking that it is applied fairly." There was a firmness in his voice, a sense of dignity that came from knowing his rights and understanding his responsibilities. The officer's hands rested near his belt, a subtle but clear sign of authority and potential aggression. The man noticed it and remained cautious, careful with every movement. He knew that in moments like these, even small gestures could be misinterpreted. Yet he did not let fear control him. Instead, he focused on clear communication and measured responses. "Step back from the vehicle," the officer commanded, his tone now a mix of suspicion and irritation. The man complied, taking a few steps away from the car while keeping his posture relaxed. He could sense the officer's frustration building, the way he tapped his foot and shifted his weight. There was a tension in the air that went beyond the routine stop, something personal and unnecessary that the man could not ignore. The man tried to speak calmly. "Officer, I understand you have your duties. I'm cooperating fully. Can we resolve this peacefully?" The officer's eyes flashed, caught between authority and bias. He seemed torn, unsure how to proceed with someone who remained calm under pressure, someone who did not react the way he expected. The minutes stretched, each one heavier than the last. The man noticed the way the officer's hand hovered near his holster, the subtle tightening of his jaw, the impatient gestures. Yet he did not panic. He reminded himself that control over one's emotions was the best tool in situations like this. He remained grounded, taking slow breaths and keeping his voice steady. The officer finally spoke, his tone a mixture of authority and doubt. "You're awfully calm for someone I just pulled over. You don't seem scared," the man replied with quiet honesty. "I believe in staying calm and respectful. I know my rights and I respect yours. That is all." There was a clarity in his response, a steady confidence that contrasted sharply with the officer's unease. Around them, the night carried on as if nothing had happened. A car passed by slowly, headlights illuminating the scene for a brief moment. The officer glanced at the passing car, then back at the man, his suspicion growing yet mingled with uncertainty. He seemed caught between instinct and protocol, unsure how to proceed with someone who did not fit the assumptions he had made. The man, sensing that the encounter could escalate further, decided it was time to reveal more about himself without provoking anger. He spoke in a calm, even tone. "Officer, I understand your caution. I want to assure you that I am who I say I am. I am prepared to provide any proof necessary." There was a seriousness in his voice that demanded attention, a quiet authority that made the officer hesitate. The officer's face tightened, a flicker of doubt crossing his expression. He seemed to struggle with the tension between his preconceived notions and the reality before him. The man stood patiently, unwavering, maintaining eye contact without aggression. There was a subtle power in his composure, a reminder that calmness could be more commanding than anger. For a moment, silence settled over the street. The only sounds were the faint hum of the city and the distant bark of a dog. The man remained steadfast, aware that the situation was delicate. He understood that a single misstep could turn an ordinary stop into something far more dangerous. Yet he remained unshaken, grounded in his knowledge, experience, and confidence. The officer finally exhaled slowly, a sign of inner conflict. He had been prepared to assert control forcefully, but the man's calm demeanor disrupted his expectations. There was a moment of realization, a faint recognition that perhaps he had misjudged the situation, yet his pride and habitual assumptions made it difficult to admit outright. The man took another step forward, maintaining a respectful distance, and said, "Officer, I'm committed to cooperating. I ask only that you approach this with fairness. I respect your role and I expect that same respect in return." His words were steady, deliberate, and sincere. They carried the weight of someone who had faced far more dangerous situations, yet understood the value of measured communication. The officer hesitated, his posture softening slightly. The tension in his eyes was still present, but there was a shift, a recognition that this encounter was not as straightforward as he had assumed. The man's calm authority had begun to influence the dynamic, changing the balance of power subtly but decisively. As the minutes passed, the night seemed to stretch longer, the quiet of the streets emphasizing the intensity of the moment. The man remained patient, aware that he needed to navigate carefully. He continued to stand tall, his presence calm but unmistakably authoritative. The officer's aggression had not vanished entirely, but it was now tempered by uncertainty and respect. Finally, the officer spoke, his voice lower and less harsh. "You're awfully composed. Most people would be nervous in this situation." The man nodded slightly and replied, "I believe in staying calm, officer. It helps everyone involved." There was a quiet dignity in his response, a sense of moral and personal strength that could not be ignored. The encounter continued in this delicate balance, the night wrapping around them like a silent witness. The man's patience, respect, and composure created a subtle shift in the interaction. The officer's suspicion remained, but it was now accompanied by a growing awareness that assumptions could be dangerous. The man had shown without aggression, that calmness and integrity could hold power in tense situations. Time seemed to move slowly, each moment stretching as the man maintained his poise. The officer's movements were measured now, less impulsive, as he considered his next step carefully. The man understood that the first impression often dictated the rest of the encounter, and he had established a foundation of respect, calmness, and authority that could not be easily undermined. The street remained quiet, the distant city noises blending into a soft background hum. The man took slow breaths, maintaining focus, aware that the situation could still escalate. Yet there was a sense of control, a quiet assurance that he was handling the encounter with intelligence and composure. He knew that remaining human, respectful and grounded was the most effective way to navigate the officer's hostility. The officer finally shifted his stance, a sign that he was reconsidering his approach. The man noticed the subtle change and maintained his calm demeanor. He knew that patience and clarity often disarmed tension more effectively than anger or confrontation. The night stretched on, the quiet punctuated only by the occasional sound of distant traffic or a passing pedestrian. The man's mind remained alert, aware of every movement, every nuance in the officer's behavior. He continued to communicate with respect and clarity, ensuring that each word conveyed his intentions without provoking conflict. The officer's tone softened slightly, the edge of hostility less pronounced but still present. There was a delicate dance of power and authority unfolding, one that required patience, intelligence, and composure. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man prepared to reveal more about himself to prevent further escalation. He understood that clarity and transparency could change the dynamic completely, and he was ready to take that step. The night remained still, the city a quiet witness to this tense and important moment, a reminder of how quickly ordinary situations could become complicated when assumptions and bias came into play. The air was tense, carrying a weight heavier than the night itself. The man standing by the side of his car could feel the officer's suspicion radiating from him. Every movement the officer made seemed calculated, every word edged with mistrust. The man remained calm, taking slow, measured breaths. He knew that keeping his composure was not just for his own safety, but it might prevent the situation from spiraling out of control. The officer adjusted his uniform, shifting the weight of his stance, a subtle sign of agitation. "You know, most people don't talk back to me like that," he said, trying to assert dominance. The man tilted his head slightly, his expression composed. "I am not talking back, officer. I am cooperating fully. I only want us to resolve this peacefully." There was no hint of anger in his voice, only a firm calmness that seemed to momentarily confuse the officer. The officer stepped closer, his voice lowering. "I don't like being questioned. You don't think I know what I'm doing, do you?" The man held his ground, keeping his hands visible. "I trust that you are doing your job, officer. I am only asking that it be done fairly." The tension hung heavy, thickening the space between them like an invisible barrier. The officer's eyes narrowed, scanning the man's face for signs of deceit, while the man remained steady, aware that his patience was the strongest tool he had. Around them, the street was almost deserted. A lone jogger passed by, glancing curiously at the scene but keeping a safe distance. The officer glanced briefly at the passing figure and returned his attention to the man, whose calm demeanor was beginning to challenge the officer's assumptions. There was a subtle power in the way the man carried himself, quiet yet unmistakable. The officer's hand hovered near his belt, the unconscious gesture of someone ready to assert authority. The man noticed but did not flinch or react defensively. He had learned long ago that controlling one's fear and maintaining clarity could prevent unnecessary escalation. He continued speaking calmly, hoping to reach the part of the officer that was guided by reason rather than bias. "Officer, I respect your authority and I am following your instructions. I just ask that you treat me as you would anyone else." The officer paused for a moment, caught between instinct and reflection. He seemed to be weighing the man's words, trying to reconcile his own preconceived notions with the reality before him. He shifted his weight, unsure whether to push harder or reconsider his approach. The man noticed the hesitation and remained silent, giving the officer space to process the situation. Suddenly, the officer's voice grew sharper again. "I've pulled over countless drivers, and I can tell when someone isn't being honest. You feel different? You're hiding something." The man took a small step back, still calm, and said, "I am not hiding anything, officer. I am telling you the truth. I understand your concern, but there is nothing illegal here." His tone was steady, almost soothing, as if trying to calm not only the officer but the energy of the moment itself. The officer's eyes darted to the man's car, then back at him. "Do you expect me to just take your word for it?" he demanded. I would not ask you to, officer. I am prepared to show you proof of my identity if necessary, the man replied. There was a quiet authority in his voice, a weight that seemed to make the officer hesitate. The night seemed to stretch endlessly. The faint hum of distant traffic was the only background noise, punctuated by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The man noticed the way the officer's jaw tightened, the subtle shaking of his hands, the tension in his shoulders. It was clear that the officer was struggling between his duty and his biases, unsure of how to proceed. A distant dog barked, breaking the heavy silence for a moment, yet it did not ease the tension. The man took another slow breath, grounding himself in the present. He knew that the key to surviving situations like this was control over one's own reactions. He remained fully composed, his calmness a silent force that challenged the officer's aggression. The officer finally spoke, his voice low and slightly uncertain. Why are you so calm? Most people would be shaking right now. The man's lips curved into a faint, respectful smile. I have faced situations where panic would have made things worse. Calmness helps people think clearly, officer. That includes both of us. There was a quiet wisdom in his words, and for a brief moment the officer seemed to consider them seriously. The officer stepped back slightly, his hand leaving the edge of his belt. His breathing was heavier now, betraying his inner conflict. You don't seem scared, and I don't understand why, he muttered. The man maintained eye contact, his tone even. Fear does not serve anyone here, officer. I respect your role and your responsibilities. I ask only that you respect mine. His words were deliberate, carrying a firmness that subtly shifted the dynamic. Time passed slowly. The officer's gaze lingered on the man, scanning for signs of deception but found none. The calm assurance in the man's stance was disarming. It was clear that he was not an ordinary driver. Yet the officer could not place exactly what made him different. There was intelligence, awareness, and confidence in the way he held himself, qualities that unsettled the officer. The man took a small, careful step closer, maintaining a safe distance, and spoke softly. Officer, I understand the responsibility you carry. I am not here to challenge your authority. I only wish for this encounter to be fair and safe. His words seemed to hang in the night air, soft yet impossible to ignore. The officer's eyes flickered with hesitation, unsure how to respond. Around them, the city carried on, unaware of the confrontation taking place on this quiet street. A car passed slowly, its headlights briefly illuminating the tense scene. The officer glanced at it and then back at the man, a mixture of suspicion and uncertainty clouding his features. The man's calm demeanor continued to unsettle him, revealing the fragility of assumptions built on bias. The officer's hand returned to his belt, a reflex of authority, but he did not reach for it aggressively. You're not scared, he said again, more as a statement than a question. The man nodded slightly. I have learned that staying composed is the best way to handle challenging situations. Fear only makes things harder for everyone involved. There was no arrogance in his words, only a quiet strength that commanded attention. The officer's expression softened slightly, though doubt and tension were still present. He seemed to be reconsidering his next move, caught between the habitual assumptions that guided his behavior and the reality before him. The man noticed the subtle shift and remained patient, allowing the officer to find his own balance without provocation. Finally, the officer's tone changed, a mixture of frustration and curiosity. You act like you know more than me. The man shook his head gently. I am not claiming to know more, officer. I am only demonstrating that calmness and respect are powerful tools. That is all. There was an understated authority in his voice, the kind that commanded respect without intimidation. The officer paused, his posture slightly less rigid, but tension still lingered in his eyes. Why aren't you like everyone else? He asked quietly. The man replied simply, I have faced difficult situations before, officer. I know that panic and aggression do not solve problems. Remaining calm helps everyone involved, including you. His words were measured, deliberate, and carried an undeniable truth. The silence that followed was heavy but not hostile. The man's steady presence seemed to fill the space, a quiet force that challenged the officer's assumptions without confrontation. The night remained still around them, the faint sounds of the city a soft backdrop to the intense interaction. The officer's gaze shifted to the man's car, scanning it again, but there was no sign of wrongdoing. The man noticed the glance and remained composed, not offering excuses or defensive gestures. He knew that showing fear or agitation would only escalate the situation, so he continued to exude calmness, patience, and clarity. Minutes passed like hours. The officer's hand rested near his belt, a subtle tension remaining, but his voice was less sharp, his movements more measured. The man sensed that the encounter had shifted, that his calm approach had begun to influence the officer's perception. There was a delicate balance of power now, shaped by composure rather than aggression. The man decided it was time to prepare for the next step, to reveal enough information to prevent further escalation without provoking anger. He remained still, allowing the officer to process the current reality. The night seemed to pause around them, a silent witness to the unfolding tension, a reminder of how ordinary interactions could become complicated when bias and assumptions took over. The officer finally spoke again, his tone quieter, almost hesitant. "You're different from most people I stop. I don't understand why." The man nodded slightly, maintaining eye contact. "I understand, officer. I only hope that my actions show respect and cooperation. That is all I wish to communicate." His words were simple, clear, and impossible to misinterpret. They carried a weight of experience, wisdom, and humanity that began to penetrate the officer's rigid assumptions. The street remained quiet, the distant sounds of the city blending with the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. The man's calm presence seemed to fill the space, a stabilizing force against the officer's uncertainty. He knew that patience, clarity, and respect were the most powerful tools he had in this tense moment, and he wielded them carefully, deliberately, and effectively. The tension on the quiet street reached its peak, as the officer's suspicion clashed with the man's calm composure. After long minutes of silence and careful observation, the man realized it was time to reveal a crucial truth that could change the direction of the encounter. He drew a steady breath and spoke in a firm, calm voice. "Officer, there is something important you need to know. I am not an ordinary citizen. I am an agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and I am currently engaged in a sensitive operation." The officer froze, his expression unreadable for a moment. The words hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. He blinked several times, trying to process what he had just heard. The suspicion in his eyes was mixed now with disbelief. "You're joking," he said cautiously, his tone edged with uncertainty. The man shook his head, his face composed and serious. "I am not joking, officer. I understand how unusual this may seem, but I am prepared to show you proof." The officer's hand twitched near his belt, a reflex born of years on duty, but the man's calm presence prevented him from escalating the situation further. The man reached slowly into his pocket and produced his identification, holding it carefully so the officer could see it without feeling threatened. The silver badge and credentials caught the dim streetlight, and the officer's eyes widened slightly as he read the official designation. "FBI?" the officer asked, his voice a mixture of astonishment and caution. "Yes," the man replied calmly. "I am working on a case that requires confidentiality. I understand why this might appear suspicious, but I assure you there is no threat here." The officer's posture softened slightly, though tension still lingered in his shoulders. The realization that he had been confronting an FBI agent who was calm, composed, and clearly in control of the situation left him momentarily speechless. The man continued to speak, his voice steady and deliberate. "I respect your role and your authority. I am showing you my credentials to prevent any misunderstanding and to ensure that we both handle this situation safely and professionally." The officer, still processing the revelation, looked down at the badge again and then back at the man. His mind raced, trying to reconcile his initial assumptions with the new reality. For a moment, silence settled between them, broken only by the faint hum of distant traffic. The man's calm authority created a space where the officer could reconsider his actions without losing face. The man remained patient, knowing that this pause was crucial for de-escalation. He kept his hands visible, his stance relaxed, yet his presence commanded respect. The officer's voice was quieter now, tinged with embarrassment and confusion. I didn't know," he admitted, his tone less harsh than before. "I misjudged the situation." The man nodded slightly, maintaining a respectful demeanor. "I understand, officer. Assumptions can be dangerous. It is important to always approach situations fairly and without bias. There was no accusation in his words, only a calm reminder of the principles that guided justice. The officer rubbed the back of his neck, his earlier bravado replaced by a mix of guilt and reflection. He glanced at the man's vehicle and then back at him, a subtle acknowledgement that he had acted hastily. "You handled this well," he said finally, his tone more measured. "Most people would have panicked or argued." The man smiled faintly, appreciating the officer's attempt to recognize his composure. "Calmness can prevent misunderstandings, officer. It is not about being fearless, but about remaining clear-headed and respectful under pressure." The street around them remained quiet, the soft glow of the streetlights casting long shadows that danced across the pavement. The night air seemed to hold its breath, as if aware of the gravity of the moment. The man's calm presence had shifted the energy, turning what could have been a dangerous confrontation into a controlled, informative exchange. The officer's voice wavered slightly as he spoke again. "Why didn't you say anything earlier? I could have called this in and we might have handled it differently." The man nodded, his expression serious. "I wanted to give you a chance to assess the situation without assumptions. Revealing my role too soon can also create risks for ongoing operations. I hope you can understand that." The officer's gaze softened as he considered the explanation, realizing the careful balance the man had maintained between authority and safety. The man continued, taking a slow, deliberate breath. "I understand why you were cautious. I respect your responsibilities. But it is equally important to ensure that caution does not turn into prejudice or unfair treatment. We are all human, and mistakes can happen when assumptions guide actions instead of facts." The officer's shoulders relaxed slightly, the tension in his jaw easing. He seemed to be reflecting on his own behavior, acknowledging the danger of letting personal bias interfere with professional duty. The man's voice remained steady, reinforcing the lessons embedded in the moment. "I hope this encounter can serve as a reminder that respect, patience, and calm observation can prevent unnecessary harm. Even in high-pressure situations, fairness and humanity must guide actions." The officer nodded slowly, visibly affected by the clarity and wisdom in the man's words. It was clear that this interaction would linger in his thoughts long after the night ended. The officer then spoke, his voice quieter and more thoughtful. "I need to report this to make sure my actions are documented properly." The man agreed, handing over the badge again for verification. "Of course, officer. Transparency is important. I want to ensure there is no confusion or misinterpretation of events." The officer studied the credentials carefully, double-checking the authenticity and making mental notes for his report. As the officer made a call on his radio, the man stepped back, giving him space to complete the communication. The situation had shifted entirely. What began as a tense and potentially hostile encounter was now a controlled interaction rooted in respect, patience, and clarity. The officer's body language had softened and his tone was more professional, reflecting a new awareness of his earlier behavior. The man observed the officer discreetly, noting the subtle changes in demeanor. He understood that this moment was as much about teaching and learning as it was about clearing suspicion. His calm, steady presence had not only prevented escalation, but had also provided a human lesson in fairness and respect. The officer hung up the radio and turned to face the man. "Everything checks out," he said, a hint of relief in his voice. I overreacted. I should have approached this differently." The man nodded, accepting the acknowledgement. "Acknowledgement is the first step toward improvement, officer. Reflecting on our actions helps prevent similar situations in the future." The night continued quietly, the city sounds a distant hum. The man prepared to leave, ready to return to his duties while understanding the lingering impact of the encounter. The officer watched him with a mixture of respect and newfound awareness, the tension replaced with a contemplative silence. There was a sense that both men had gained something from the interaction, a subtle but powerful shift in perspective. As the man walked toward his vehicle, he spoke one last time. "Officer, thank you for listening and for handling this with professionalism once the truth was revealed. It is a reminder that patience and respect can guide even the most difficult moments." The officer nodded, a quiet acknowledgement that the encounter had been transformative, a rare lesson learned in the course of duty. The man entered his car and started the engine, the soft hum breaking the silence of the street. He drove away slowly, aware that the night had been a mix of danger, tension, and profound human interaction. The officer remained standing by the roadside, reflecting on the events and silently acknowledging the lessons learned. The night had changed something within him, a reminder that fairness and humanity must always guide authority, and that assumptions, especially those influenced by bias, can have serious consequences. As the man disappeared into the distance, the streetlights continued their quiet watch. The officer stayed for a moment longer, collecting his thoughts and preparing to file the necessary reports. The experience would stay with him, a lasting reminder of the unexpected turns life can take, and the importance of remaining fair, patient, and human even in situations fraught with tension. The night returned to its quiet rhythm, but the echoes of the encounter lingered in the minds of both men, a lesson in respect, calmness, and the careful balance between authority and humanity. Both had learned something invaluable: the power of composure, the danger of assumptions, and the profound impact that a single interaction can have when approached with understanding and integrity. The days after the encounter weighed heavily on the officer. He could not stop replaying the events in his mind, each detail feeling sharper and more significant than it had in the moment. Every turn he took on the city streets reminded him of how quickly assumptions could turn dangerous. Each stop he made carried the quiet echo of that night, a reminder that his approach to his job could have serious consequences. He felt an uncomfortable mixture of guilt, shame, and a growing determination to change. He started arriving at the station earlier than usual, going through paperwork slowly, double-checking every detail, and observing his own behavior critically. During briefings, he listened more than he spoke, noticing how his colleagues interacted with the public and how he had acted in comparison. Even minor exchanges with coworkers prompted reflection. Was he treating everyone fairly? Was he letting unconscious assumptions guide him? He realized he needed more than just internal reflection. He needed action. At first, the change was subtle. He adjusted his tone when speaking with the public, made a conscious effort to keep his body language neutral, and focused on fully understanding the circumstances before making judgments. He practiced patience, reminding himself of the man he had encountered and how calm composure had shifted the entire situation. It became a personal mission to emulate that calm, measured approach, while still maintaining authority. He took time to review past encounters, mentally replaying them, identifying moments where assumptions might have influenced his decisions. Some were minor, some more serious, and he realized that bias could creep in even when he thought he was fair. He took notes, reflecting on how to handle similar situations differently in the future. He started keeping a journal, documenting his thoughts, reactions, and lessons from every significant interaction. Writing became a form of accountability, forcing him to confront his own mistakes and think through better choices. The officer began attending training sessions, not just the mandatory ones, but additional workshops focused on communication, empathy, and understanding unconscious bias. He participated actively, asking questions, listening carefully, and thinking about how the lessons applied to his daily work. He began discussing approaches with more experienced officers, learning new ways to de-escalate situations without letting assumptions dictate his actions. Slowly, he could see how these lessons could reshape the way he approached every stop and interaction. At home, he struggled with reflection. He thought about the fear that could have escalated if the man had reacted differently, the subtle ways that power and authority could harm someone unfairly. These thoughts were uncomfortable but necessary. He acknowledged that growth often came from facing discomfort, not avoiding it. He used these reflections to prepare mentally for the next day, reminding himself that fairness and humanity were not optional. They were essential. The FBI agent he had encountered also remained in his mind, not just for the revelation of identity, but for the professionalism and composure he displayed. The officer admired the discipline it must have taken to stay calm in the face of hostility and misunderstanding. He realized that respect and patience could not only prevent escalation, but also teach valuable lessons about human interaction and fairness. It was a lesson he would carry with him constantly. His colleagues noticed the change. Some were supportive, some indifferent, and others skeptical, but he persisted quietly. He shared reflections when appropriate, emphasizing fairness, patience, and communication, hoping that even small shifts could create a safer, more respectful culture in the department. He learned that personal growth could influence a larger environment, and that leadership came in many forms, including leading by example. Community interactions became a priority. He started attending neighborhood meetings and public forums, engaging respectfully, listening actively, and demonstrating a commitment to fairness and safety. He shared lessons without disclosing sensitive details, emphasizing the importance of calm, respectful engagement in every encounter. The community noticed the difference, small as it was, and trust began to grow, a slow but tangible reminder of the impact of responsible policing. During patrols, every stop became an exercise in mindfulness. He consciously slowed his responses, monitored his tone, maintained neutral body language, and made sure to communicate clearly and respectfully. Each encounter reminded him that assumptions could have serious consequences, and that fairness required active effort, not just passive awareness. Over time, this approach began to feel natural, a reflection of the lessons he had internalized from that one transformative night. In quieter moments, he reflected on the broader societal implications. He thought about those who faced racial profiling without the advantage of experience or authority. He acknowledged his own responsibility to mitigate harm whenever possible, and to hold himself accountable even when no one was watching. These reflections deepened his empathy and strengthened his resolve to act with fairness and integrity consistently. He began mentoring new recruits, sharing insights about communication, patience, and bias awareness. He emphasized the importance of listening, observing, and understanding before acting. Through mentorship, he could influence the next generation of officers, helping to cultivate a culture that valued fairness, respect, and humanity over assumptions and haste. Each conversation with the recruit reinforced his own learning and reminded him of the long-term impact one person could have. As months passed, he noticed a tangible change in his approach and mindset. He was more deliberate in actions, more thoughtful in decisions, and more aware of the subtle dynamics that could escalate situations. Supervisors commented on his professionalism and composure, and he took their feedback seriously, continuously seeking to improve. The lessons of the night with the FBI agent had become integrated into his professional identity, shaping his behavior in ways that were evident to those around him. He also began reflecting on his own personal life, considering how bias and assumptions affected interactions outside of work. This self-awareness influenced his behavior in social settings, making him more patient, empathetic, and considerate. The officer realized that growth was holistic, affecting both professional and personal spheres, and that one informed the other in meaningful ways. He would sometimes return mentally to the street where it all began, picturing the quiet night, the flashing lights, and the calm presence of the FBI agent. The memory was a reminder of what could have gone wrong, but also of the power of composure, patience, and respectful communication. It became a symbol of accountability, personal growth, and the responsibility inherent in authority. Each recollection reinforced the principles he now lived by and shared with others. The city carried on, unaware of the personal transformation taking place within one officer. Streets bustled during the day, quieted at night, but the lessons of that night remained alive in his mind. Every interaction, every decision, was an opportunity to apply the insights gained. The officer understood that true professionalism required constant self-reflection and commitment to fairness, no matter how ordinary or routine the moment appeared. By the end of the year, he had documented a series of personal and professional improvements in his journal. He reviewed incidents, analyzed his responses, and noted growth in communication, empathy, and judgment. He recognized that accountability was an ongoing process, and that each day off he read a new chance to reinforce fairness and respect. The encounter had transformed not just his approach to policing, but his understanding of responsibility, humanity, and the importance of integrity. The officer realized that mistakes were inevitable, but growth and learning were deliberate choices. The night with the FBI agent had become a touchstone, a reminder of the consequences of bias and the transformative power of calm, respectful interaction. He carried these lessons forward, guiding his decisions, interactions, and reflections, ensuring that each moment offered the possibility of positive impact and understanding. Months had passed since the night that changed everything for the officer. The memory of the encounter with the FBI agent remained vivid, a constant reminder of the importance of fairness, patience, and calmness in every interaction. The lessons he had learned were no longer theoretical. They had become a living part of his approach to policing and life. Each day presented opportunities to apply what he had internalized, and he did so with care and mindfulness. The officer began his shift early one morning, feeling a quiet sense of purpose. He reviewed his schedule, noting the areas of the city he would patrol, and prepared himself mentally for the day. Each stop, each interaction was an opportunity to reinforce trust, fairness, and understanding. He reminded himself to remain calm, to observe carefully, and to listen fully before making judgments. The memory of the FBI agent's composed authority guided him, shaping his responses and decisions. During his first patrol, he encountered a young man riding a bicycle without a helmet. Normally, such a situation might have led to a stern warning or immediate ticketing, but today, the officer approached differently. He spoke calmly, explaining the importance of safety and offering a helmet from his patrol car for the young man to wear. The interaction was respectful and informative, and the young man thanked him sincerely. The officer felt a quiet satisfaction, recognizing that respectful engagement could be more effective than authority alone. Later, he stopped at a neighborhood park where children were playing and residents were gathering. He walked among the people, greeting them warmly and listening attentively to their concerns. A mother approached, sharing her worries about local traffic and safety. The officer took notes, assured her that the concerns would be addressed, and promised to return with updates. He felt the difference in how people responded to him now. There was trust, openness, and a willingness to engage, a reflection of the lessons he had learned from that transformative night. In the afternoon, a call came in about a minor dispute between neighbors. The officer arrived promptly, approaching the scene with calmness and measured words. He listened to both sides, ensuring that each person felt heard and understood. Through careful dialogue, he mediated the situation, helping the neighbors reach a resolution without escalation. He recognized how much his approach had changed from before, when assumptions and quick judgments might have intensified the conflict. The memory of the FBI agent's patience and composure guided his every word and action. Throughout the day, the officer reflected on the growth he had achieved. The journal he kept had become an invaluable tool, recording insights, challenges, and reminders. Reviewing it regularly allowed him to remain accountable to himself and to the community he served. Each entry reinforced the importance of fairness, empathy, and self-awareness, reminding him that every interaction mattered and that the consequences of bias could be profound. As the sun set, he returned to the station for debriefing. Supervisors noted the changes in his approach, praising his patience, communication, and respect in handling situations. Colleagues asked about his methods, curious about how he remained composed in tense circumstances. The officer shared his reflections carefully, emphasizing calm observation, clear communication, and the avoidance of assumptions. He stressed that these principles were not just techniques but a mindset, a way of approaching every interaction with humanity and integrity. In private moments, the officer continued to reflect on the encounter with the FBI agent. He considered how close the situation had come to potential danger, and how different choices could have led to disastrous outcomes. The thought was sobering, but it also reinforced his commitment to fairness and self-awareness. He understood that authority carried responsibility, and that even routine actions could profoundly impact the lives of others. This awareness guided his behavior continuously, shaping both professional and personal decisions. Community members began noticing the consistent change in the officer's approach. They appreciated the patience, respect, and fairness he displayed, and slowly, trust grew in neighborhoods where tension had once been high. The officer recognized that rebuilding trust was a long process requiring ongoing effort, honesty, and consistent behavior. Each positive interaction reinforced the lessons learned and motivated him to continue improving. During one evening patrol, the officer encountered an elderly man struggling to carry groceries across the street. Without hesitation, he stepped forward, offering assistance and walking with him to his home. The man thanked him warmly, expressing gratitude not just for the help, but for the respectful and considerate manner in which it was offered. The officer reflected on how small actions, performed with patience and respect, could make a meaningful difference in someone's life. It was a lesson in humility and humanity, reinforcing the values he had embraced since that night. The officer also took time to mentor newer recruits. He shared his experiences, emphasizing the importance of self-reflection, patience, and communication. He recounted lessons from the night with the FBI agent, focusing on the power of calm composure, respect, and fairness. His mentees listened attentively, learning not just from his words but from the behavior and attitude he consistently demonstrated. The officer understood that mentoring was an opportunity to influence future generations, promoting a culture of fairness, integrity, and empathy. As weeks turned into months, the officer noticed changes within himself beyond his professional role. His relationships with family and friends improved as he applied patience and understanding in personal interactions. He became more reflective, more empathetic, and more conscious of how his words and actions affected others. The encounter with the FBI agent had left a lasting impression, guiding his personal growth and reminding him of the importance of accountability, fairness, and humanity in all areas of life. One day, the officer received a call from a community leader requesting a discussion on improving safety and trust in the neighborhood. He attended the meeting, actively listening, taking notes, and engaging in thoughtful dialogue. Residents expressed concerns about previous encounters with law enforcement and shared suggestions for fostering better communication. The officer responded with honesty, acknowledging past mistakes and outlining proactive steps to ensure fairness and safety. The meeting ended positively, leaving both the officer and the community members with a sense of mutual respect and commitment. The officer continued documenting his experiences, reflecting on challenges, successes, and areas for improvement. His journal had become a record of growth, a tool for self-awareness, and a reminder of the night that had changed everything. Each entry reinforced the values of patience, fairness, and respect, ensuring that the lessons were not forgotten or taken for granted. It was a personal commitment to continuous improvement and accountability. During routine patrols, the officer noticed that the calm and respectful approach often de-escalated potential conflicts before they arose. Individuals responded more positively to clear communication and measured actions. The officer realized that assumptions and quick judgments were often the root of tension, and by consciously avoiding them, he could foster safer, more constructive interactions. The memory of the FBI agent's composed demeanor remained a guide, a model for how authority could be exercised responsibly and humanely. The officer also reflected on the broader implications of bias and prejudice in law enforcement. He understood that systemic change required both personal growth and institutional support. He engaged in discussions with supervisors and colleagues about training, community engagement, and policy improvements. His insights, grounded in personal experience, contributed to a culture of reflection and responsibility within the department. He recognized that meaningful change was gradual, but every effort mattered. In quieter moments, he considered the courage of the FBI agent that night. Remaining calm under scrutiny, demonstrating professionalism despite provocation, and asserting authority with respect were qualities that required immense discipline and self-control. The officer admired these traits and integrated them into his approach, understanding that true strength lay not in aggression or dominance, but in measured, respectful action. As the year progressed, the officer noticed tangible improvements in the community's response to law enforcement. Residents approached him with questions, concerns, and suggestions. They acknowledged his efforts to engage respectfully and fairly. The officer recognized that trust was not built overnight, but through consistent, deliberate actions rooted in empathy and fairness. He felt a quiet satisfaction in seeing the positive impact of his efforts, an